on a practical note. We, of course, had skipped a week here, but, the last that we had looked at the situation here in Acts chapter 15, there was a disturbance. There was some problems that had arisen about the nature of keeping the law and whether that was a component of salvation. And, of course, they had come to Jerusalem to kind of debate the matter with the other apostles and with the church leaders there in Jerusalem. And we kind of talked about that last time. But now, in the middle of this conversation, we pick it up in verse 12. And it says, after they had established that the Mosaic law was not a part of salvation, it says in verse 12, all the multitude kept silence and gave audience to Barnabas and Paul, declaring what miracles and wonders God had wrought among the Gentiles by them. And then it says, after they had held their peace, James answered, saying, men and brethren, hearken unto me. So they had just established some issues of doctrine, and James waits until everybody gets done, debating this and resolving this and making sure it was taken care of. And we begin now, if I was to change the narrative in terms of what is being said, James basically says, hey, okay, now that we've established that, let's talk about some things that are practical. Let's talk about things from a practical perspective here. Oftentimes we lose our practicality in what we do and how we live, and we get so caught up sometimes in doctrine and resolving the matter that in practice, sometimes things look a little bit different. There's a story of a man that was flying in a hot air balloon, and he realized that he was lost. He was traveling and didn't realize where he was at, so he reduced his altitude, and he spots this man down in a field below. So he lowers this balloon down so he could at least shout down to him from up in the hot air balloon, and he yells down to the man in the field, excuse me, can you tell me where I am? And the man down below takes a look at it a little bit and looks up at him, and he says, well, yes, he says, you're in a hot air balloon. You're about 30 feet above this field. And the guy in the hot air balloon, he shook his head and he says, you must be an engineer. And the guy said at the bottom, he says, how did you know that? He says, I am an engineer. He says, well, everything you've told me is technically correct, but it's practically useless for anyone to be of any good. The man below says, well, he says, you must be in management. And he says, well, I am. How do you know that? He says, well, because you don't know where you are. You don't know where you're going. And you expect me to be able to help, but you're in the same position you were in before we met, but now it's my fault. Sometimes we can give a lot of technically correct advice or information about the Bible and not really be a lot of practical use to people. And so this was really, I think, what was on James' heart when he got here in the middle of this council, and they had been debating this whole matter of the law of Moses and whether it was a component of salvation. And they had established that fact, as we mentioned. It was determined there, verses 9 to 11, salvation is always by grace through faith. And that's true for both Jews and Gentiles. And there was no components of works or keeping the law in salvation. This was a settled fact they had decided upon. But it says now, Paul and Barnabas get up. They celebrate what God was doing there with the Gentiles there in verse 12. And then James kind of comes around and he says, but in a practical sense, we need to deal with a couple of these issues. There are some real practical things that come out of this discussion that we really need to get some understanding of. And that's what he really wants to deal with. Now, James here was the half-brother of Jesus. James, who is speaking, was probably viewed by many as the senior pastor of the church there in Jerusalem. He wasn't one of the 12 apostles. They were there at the church too, or at least a number of them were. But he was kind of looked at as the head pastor or the lead pastor in the church in Jerusalem at this time. And so he had some weight and some bearing in terms of what his voice was to say. And we also have to remember that the vast majority of the church in Jerusalem, keep this in mind, were Jewish believers. They were, remember, it started at the day of Pentecost. There were 3,000 Jews that had come to Christ, and many after that had come to Christ. So the majority of the church in Jerusalem at this time, which was thousands of members large, was of Jewish origin and Jewish culture. It was a part of what they were doing. And so the first thing that we see James wants to describe on a practical note is a confirmation of what was just said. Here was lots of good debate. It was good something scholarly that they were talking about. It had practical importance for the church at Antioch, which you remember was being questioned about their faith because the church at Antioch had a good number of Gentiles in it. But here James, as the leader of the mostly Jewish church in Jerusalem, he needed to confirm the same thing for himself and for the people that were there with him. It says in verse 13, after they held their peace, James answered, saying, Men and brethren, hearken unto me. Simeon hath declared how God at the first did visit the Gentiles, talking about Peter, Simon Peter. He says, Peter's declared this, to take them out a people for his name, and to this agree the words of the prophets. And then he begins to quote some of the prophets. So what does James begin by doing? He confirms what had already been decided doctrinally. He confirms that we not only have the testimony of Paul, who's where this all started from. Remember, Paul got back from his first missionary journey, had seen all of these Gentiles come to Christ, and then got questioned when he got back that maybe they're really not saved. Right? This was a real crisis in the early church and the early missions work. So Paul had his testimony. He came and talked to Peter. Peter gave his testimony. They had come up with this agreement, this truth. But he says, hey, it's not just Paul's word. It's not just Peter's word. He says, also the prophets agree with this. If we go back and delve into the Old Testament, if we really study what the Bible has to say, they're confirming that salvation would come to the Gentiles, and that salvation would always be holy by grace through faith. And this was something that maybe they hadn't thought about before, but he quotes from Amos chapter 9 here, verses 11 to 12, in verses 16 and 17. And this is an important point to understand. James says, basically, I'm 100% in agreement with the verdict of Peter and the apostles. And I'm going to confirm also that the prophets, the Old Testament, confirms this to be true as well. And James, who was pastoring this largely Jewish church, they for a large part would not have changed anything about their way of life. They had come to Christ. That doesn't mean they had just, I'm not going to do, we're not going to go be a part of our Jewish culture anymore or follow the laws of Moses. They had just kind of gone on and done those things. They had come to Christ, and they didn't see any problem with doing both of these things together. So James saying this, this was teaching that they needed to hear. There were people in his church who were practicing the law of Moses. It was part of their culture, part of their life. And this disturbance that had happened with the Gentile believers, it had to be addressed that, hey, we have to preserve some unity here. Because really, this was the first real crisis in the church. This was a real problem. You could have ended up with the Jewish believers and the Gentile believers, the Jewish church and the Gentile church. And if you didn't find a way to find unity between them, it was going to be a problem. So he wasn't just saying this for his benefit. He wasn't just saying it so he could have something to say. He was affirming the truth for the benefit of his congregation and for the Jewish believers that were there. They needed to hear this. And so he says in verse 18, he continues after confirming this from the prophets, he says, known unto God are all his works from the beginning of the world. There were some people in the audience, and obviously with the debate that had gone on, who didn't see it this way. There were people there who they just figured they went hand in hand. You can be saved and you can follow the law of Moses, and they're all intertwined. But he says, hey, you know what? Maybe you didn't think about this before, but God had already had this planned. This is what he's saying in verse 18. Known unto God are all his works. God knew about all of this in advance. Many of the Jews didn't see it, and the early church even had a dispute about it. But even think about today. Do we really understand why God offers us salvation by grace through faith? I tell you, I don't understand it. I don't understand why God just offers a free gift of salvation. I don't understand why it doesn't make sense to me that we shouldn't have some component of doing something to make that happen. He shouldn't have some expectations upon me. Well, it's like the Mormon doctrine. They say, according to the Book of Mormon, God will save you after you've done all that you can do. If you ask a Mormon how to be saved, that's what they'll tell you. Of course, their understanding of who Christ is, and the devil and everybody else is all convoluted as well. But nonetheless, they basically tell you, God will save you after you've done all that you can do. Now that sounds like a good way of, I'll do all that I can do, and then God will take care of the rest. If I have $1 in my pocket and I don't have enough for a Happy Meal, I put my $1 in and he pays the rest. That seems like a fair deal, right? That's not how the gospel works. Do I understand why the gospel was set up to be by grace through faith, not of works, lest any man should boast? Well, maybe right there's our key. Paul tells us in Ephesians, right? He says, we're saved by grace because we don't need anything to boast in. Oh, I put $1 in for my Happy Meal, you put 2 in. Oh, you must be a better person than me. That's what can happen. So he gets, no, it's an even playing field. We all start with nothing. We all get freely given the grace that we need to be able to come to the Lord. And even though it doesn't always make sense to us, what James is saying here in this verse 18, he's saying, really, the less we understand about God's motives, the more we can trust that God is omniscient and all-powerful in all things. God had this figured out from the beginning. And the less I understand, the more I trust the fact that God does understand. And God knows what he's doing. And I can trust that about God. You don't want to be following or have a relationship with a God who doesn't really have it all figured out, who's just kind of figuring it out as he goes. You ever follow a leader who really, you can tell they don't really have a plan, right? And they're a day, well, what are we doing today? Well, we're just going to see what we end up doing, and you can tell they're just figuring it out as they go, feeling their way through life, They're not the kind of people you want to be as their leader, right? You want to, hey, why don't you go do your own thing? We'll find somebody who has a plan, who kind of has this figured out, who's maybe done this before. That's the kind of God we want to follow. We want to follow a God who's got it all figured out. This is what James is saying. And so he says, after he confirms these things about salvation being by faith, he says, verse 19, wherefore my sentence is that we trouble not them which from among the Gentiles are turned to God. He says, let's not trouble them with this question. They were being troubled. Remember, the Judaizers had come up from Jerusalem. They had gone to basically undermine the faith of those in Antioch who had been saved, and they were deeply troubled by this. Someone just came from Jerusalem and told me as a Gentile in a church in Antioch that you're not really saved. That's basically what they were saying. They came up and said, you're not circumcised. You're not following the law of Moses. You're not saved. Wouldn't you be troubled if someone who seemed like they know what they were talking about came and told you that? This was a troubling issue for them. And so James says, we need to make sure we aren't troubling these Gentile believers. We're not going to impose on them this the law of Moses or the circumcisions. These things were not necessary for salvation. He again confirms for them. He says, we need to confirm and reaffirm for them that their salvation is secure. It's secure in Christ and Christ alone. And sometimes we might need that little confirmation too. Sometimes we might get to feel like, well, am I really saved? I hear people say this from time to time. I just don't feel saved, or I wonder if I am, and I doubt some things about it. You know what? Sometimes we might need some confirmation too. Sometimes we just need to go back and read out of Ephesians or read out of Romans, and we can recognize, hey, salvation is a free gift. And we need to be reminded of that sometimes so that we have that confirmed in our heart. Sometimes we need to hear that. And we also need to hear that this is how God has always planned it. He planned salvation to be by faith from the beginning. It's always been the way people got to God. Not by their works, but by simply believing in a Christ that would come, that would save them from their sins. Do we always understand it? No. But we can trust that God is big enough to have it all worked out. Well, let's look at the next part of this, verse 20 and 21. So he begins by confirming the truth that they have just confirmed. Verse 21 and 20, he says, here's some practical instructions for conduct. Here's some practical advice for how we should conduct ourselves. He says, verse 20, he says, but, here's the big but we write unto them that they abstain from pollutions of idols, and from fornication, and from things strangled, and from blood. So he gets done confirming, hey, there's no question, it's how you're saved. He says, but here's some practical ideas that we need to convey to them. Salvation is confirmed, but there's some things that they need to be advised about. We need to give them some instructions because they are a mixed congregation. There's Gentile and Jewish believers together here. And so he gives this list of four things. He says, we need to give them some warnings about this. To abstain from pollutions of idols, from fornication, from things strangled or food that was strangled, and from eating blood. And of course, this seems maybe just like a strange list. We're going to talk about why this list was what it was here in a minute. But, here are just some very specific, seemingly random things. Pollutions of idols. Of course, the Gentiles were well steeped in Roman and Greek culture, where there were idols that were presented to, there were sacrifices presented to idols, and of course there was a problem with meats that were sacrificed to idols and then partaken of. Of course, fornication deals with any type of sexual sin, and adultery, and things like this. Food that was strangled and eating blood, these relate to some of the specific things that were forbidden in the law of Moses. And why do we have these particular instructions? Well, he tells us in verse 21. He says, here are the things they should abstain from. He says, for, verse 21, or because, here's why, because Moses of old time hath in every city them that preach him, being read in the synagogues every Sabbath day. James is saying, there's Jewish people everywhere in the ancient world. In their day, in their time, there was a Jewish group that had established themselves in basically every one of the cities in the world at that point in time. There were populations of Jews that had been there from the time they had begun being dispersed. Since the time of the first captivity, the Jews had begun to be dispersed throughout the world. By the time of the first century, I don't know if you think about your timelines, by the time of the first century when James would have said this, the Jews had been dispersed for over 700 years. 700 years of developing their culture and establishing their footprint in various cities all across the known world. This was a regular thing. And he says, every week, every one of these cities has a synagogue. And every week, the law of Moses gets read in those synagogues. He said, there are people who are living according to the Jewish law, and they are knowledgeable of the law of Moses, and they have taught about these dietary laws and taught about these warnings. And so there's two reasons we need to be careful of our conduct in light of the fact that there are Jews in all of these cities. He says, number one, how are you going to share the gospel with a Jew if they look at you as an unclean person? The Gentiles were looked at as dogs to the Jews, right? They were dirty dogs. That's really what it comes down to. We think it seems funny, but it's really true. They looked at them as, you don't associate with them, you don't eat dinner with them, you do everything you can to stay away from them. And so, how are you going to be an evangelist to the Jews? Do you remember what Paul just did in his first missionary journey? Every city he went to, what was his habit? He first went to the synagogue. He first went to the Jews. Paul says many, many times, hey, I'm going to share the gospel to the Jew first and also to the Gentile. So he goes to the synagogue. He preaches to the Jews. He wants to make sure they hear the gospel message clearly. And after they either choose to accept or reject Christ, what does he do? He goes into the culture around that synagogue in that city, and he evangelizes the Gentile population. And so he says, there's going to be a practical reason for this. But think about this further. Now you have Jewish believers, like they did at Antioch, alongside Gentile believers, worshiping in church together each week. He says, and a lot of these Jewish believers, they still have these convictions. They still follow these laws of Moses. They had been living that way all their life, and you know what? You just can't trample on somebody's convictions like that. You can't expect them to just say, get over it. You've got to do something because you care about where their convictions are, and you've got to do some things to make sure we have Christian unity. Now, was this a problem? Or was this kind of like, why did he even bother bringing this up? I want you to think about the timeline here. This council that we're reading about right now was convened in roughly AD 50, okay, the year 50, just 50. Okay, this was held in Jerusalem. Within 3 years of this time, within 3 years of this verdict and this council being held and these practical instructions being given by James, Paul was writing a letter. Paul was writing a letter to a church in Corinth. And that church in Corinth was dealing with these exact problems. He said in 1 Corinthians 5:1, it's reported commonly there is fornication among you, and such fornication as is not so much named among the Gentiles. That's what Paul writes to the church in Corinth. So they were having a problem with fornication at the church in Corinth. Chapter 6 and 7, he deals more and more and more with fornication. They dealt with pollutions of idols. 1 Corinthians 8, verse 4, he says, as concerning, therefore, the eating of those things that are offered in sacrifice unto idols, we know that an idol is nothing in the world, and there is none other God but one. And then in verse 7, he says, howbeit, there is not in every man that knowledge. For some with conscience of the idol unto this hour eat it as a thing offered unto an idol, and their conscience being weak is defiled. Verse 13, he says, wherefore, if meat make my brother to offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth, lest I make my brother to offend. Paul's giving very practical advice to the church in Corinth. There were those Jewish believers, just like they had talked about here at the council, that were going to be offended when they were asked to eat meat sacrificed to idols, or were dealing with these issues of sin as called out in the Mosaic Law. And so, what does this come down to? It comes down to looking at another believer who doesn't have the same convictions, same ideas as you do, and saying, I'm going to change my conduct because of who they are or what they believe. And I think that's one of the hardest things we deal with in Christendom today. Because oftentimes we think our conduct should be only based on whether the Bible tells me I can't do it or not. Right? Does the Bible, you ever have someone, especially young people, maybe teenagers, young adults even, they say, well, why can't I do X, or why can't I do this, or why can't I do this? And you say, well, here's a couple reasons. Well, can you give me a chapter and verse? If you can't give me a chapter and verse, then I'm free to do it. Well, you know what? They've missed a whole lot of what here is even being talked about at the council. There's plenty of things that we do or we don't do, not because there's a chapter and verse, but because we love our brother or sister in Christ. And that should shape our conduct as well. And so there's not always a chapter of verse. Sometimes your conduct needs to be shaped by the convictions of your church family or the ability of you to reach your culture for Christ. What did Paul say again? He said, if meat makes my brother offend, I will eat no flesh while the world standeth. He's like, if it becomes that big of an issue for them, he says, I'll become a vegetarian. Well, that's a hard thing for me to swallow. Well, this is where Paul was at. He says, I'll never eat meat again if that's what it takes so that I don't offend somebody. He says, but you know what? I care about my other brothers and sisters in Christ. It has no consequence. It has no meaning. Yeah, they should be able to get past this, but until they do, I'm going to make sure that I'm not the one that creates the division in the church. This is where he's at. You know, we don't think about, well, what does that mean like in our culture, in our day? Well, there's probably illustrations you can come up with, but here's just a simple one that it's not even in our culture today, but you know, when you go to China, okay, if you go to China, and probably in modern China it's becoming less and less this way, but China has a lot of superstitious things, like they have a lucky number and they have unlucky numbers and things that are, based on culture that they have. I don't know why, they always have these Chinese New Years, right? It's the year of the rat. I mean, why is the year of the rat something? I don't even know. I don't want a year. Let's move on to some other year that's a better symbol. But nonetheless, they have all these things, right? Well, the color black in China is considered taboo. It's considered bad luck. It's considered a bad omen. You might wear it in mourning when you have a funeral or something like that, but in general, you would certainly never want to wear black at a time when the Chinese were celebrating something like a marriage or the Chinese New Year. If you were to do that, it would be offensive to people around you. The people in China tend to know this, right? They would tend not to do this. And you're probably going to be watching Chinese TV now to see what's going on. But this is true. So if you are setting up a church in China, you know what? I'm not going to wear a black suit to the pulpit. Especially not on a day that I'm, celebrating and praising and worshiping God, because you know what? A black suit to them means bad luck. Why is the pastor standing up there with a black suit on? Well, he didn't know any better. But once he does know better, he needs to adapt, right? Throw out the black suits. That doesn't matter. This is the idea. We change our conduct based on how our conduct is being received as either an obstacle or an ability to communicate the gospel effectively. Well, let's keep moving. We have to finish this passage. So we see next that these decisions that they make, they get conveyed to the Gentiles. We see in verse 22, it pleased the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, surnamed Barsabas, and Silas, chief men among the brethren. So it was important that this message gets conveyed accurately and in the right spirit back to the church at Antioch. Remember, this is where the whole hubbub started. They were all in agreement. They all went to Jerusalem. They were all in agreement about about the doctrine that they were going to propose. It wasn't just James sending his personal thoughts. He says, we got to make sure that we have unity in the church, and to do this, we've got to convey this in a proper way. And they didn't just send Paul and Barnabas back alone and says, hey, Paul, you go back and tell the congregation, this is what we decided down here. Why is that? Well, Paul was the center of the controversy to begin with. Right? Paul and Barnabas were the ones that were being questioned and undermined from the beginning. All these Judaizers had gone up, and Paul and Barnabas came down. They were like almost the underdogs when they came down, because there was a lot of opposition to what they were teaching. And so they had a vested interest in this, and they didn't want to have them do it alone, so they sent some others along to attest to the message that it was correct and authoritative. And so then they write this letter, and verses 23 and 24. And in the letter, this says they first confirm that salvation was by faith alone again. It says, for as much as we have heard that certain which went out from among us have troubled you with words, subverting your souls, saying you must be circumcised and keep the law, to whom we gave no such commandment. So he's basically saying here in this letter to the people at the church at Antioch, hey, don't be troubled by these people's insistence at bothering you and undermining your doctrine. And don't allow your souls to be subverted. In other words, don't doubt your salvation over what they've told you, because all of those people who are trying to add works to your salvation, they're not from us. You know, like the political ads you see today, this message has been authorized by such and such a candidate, right? You're going to hear those a lot in the next month. This is what they were saying. All of those people, all those ads, all those doctrines that were put into your congregation to undermine your thoughts, he says, they weren't from us. They weren't authorized to come. They don't represent us. We did not send them. But you know what? Here's what we're sending. Here's our letter. Here's our representatives. And here's Paul and Barnabas. They're all coming back to explain to you from an authoritative way what we've decided. And so then they give in verse 28 and 29 what the instructions are again, the things that practical advice that they should be abstaining from the idols and from things strangled, from fornication. And he says, these are some of the things you should be doing. And he says at the end of this, in verse 29, if you keep yourselves, you shall do well. Now this word, shall do well, is just one verb in the Greek, and it's a plural. It's not about an individual. It's not like we would write to an individual person. They were writing to a group of people, a plural you, if you will. In the South, they would say a you all, right? This is what they were saying. They were writing to a you all, and they said, hey, you all as a church, you're all going to do well if you keep this amongst yourselves. In other words, you as a church, your ability to prosper and grow is at stake here, because your conduct has to be affected by each other's convictions. So I guess the point of this one here that I just want to bring out is that sources matter. We live in a world where sources are oftentimes undocumented or, very poor at best. You can Google anything, and if you have a disease or you have a problem, don't Google it, because you'll find that you only got a few months to live. Oh, I got a hangnail. Oh, no, it's got to be serious. 6 weeks for me. Google just told me it must be true. That's unfortunately the world we live in. And unfortunately, more and more of our news outlets are the same way. And we don't know what to believe anymore. We don't know what sources are true. It's also true in the Christian world. There's a lot of bad information out there. Oh, well, I turned it to the Christian TV channel, so it must be good. Maybe you might be better with CNN. I hate to tell you, get your doctrine from them. Sometimes the Christian TV channel has some of the worst doctrine on it. I'm not saying they're all bad, don't get me wrong, but the point is sources matter. We have to know where it came from. Is this really coming from the Bible, or is this somebody's idea? Is this false doctrine? And there's a lot of it out there. The church at Antioch needed to get some good doctrine, and it came to them through authorized agents, came from them from Scripture, and we need to be checking our sources as well, especially when it comes to doctrine. Don't just take hook, line, and sinker every guy that you see on YouTube telling you the latest news, or every guy you see on the Christian radio. They're not all made equal. We need to be careful about that. And how do we know all of this is true? Well, we see it in verse 30 to 33, all of these thoughts. He says, finally, the letter and the message gets back to the Gentiles, and they concur in a very practical way. If this was a problem, they wouldn't be so joyous, but it says, when they were dismissed, they came to Antioch, verse 30. When they had gathered the multitude together, they delivered the epistle, and which when they read, they rejoiced for their consolation. Why would the Gentile believers rejoice? They just got put a bunch of these restrictions on, right? Well, they rejoiced because their salvation wasn't in jeopardy. That was what was troubling them. They rejoiced because they didn't have to follow the law or to be circumcised in order to be saved. They had this right. It was by grace through faith. This is a thing to rejoice about. And all that they were trying to do in making these things happen, in making these suggestions and making these instructions for them, was they wanted to make sure your conduct isn't going to offend your Jewish believers, your Jewish brethren. This was a cause for rejoicing because our church is going to be strengthened from this. We can learn and grow from this opportunity. So often today, I don't think we would rejoice if somebody came and says, hey, here's some things you need to do because there's some brethren in your church who are going to be offended if you don't. what's the first reaction that we have? Well, do you know my rights? You can't show me a chapter and verse. I have liberty in Christ. I can do what I want. And you know what? They need to get over it. They're the weaker brother. Why can't they just, somebody go teach them? Tell them what it doesn't really matter. Was that how Paul approached it in Corinth? No. He said, I understand there's some convictions that people have in their hearts and their lives, and you know what? If it means I'm a vegetarian, I'm going to be a vegetarian for them. Because Christian unity, Christian community, a church family has to be united, and we care about each other. Paul puts it all together in 1 Corinthians 9. I'm sure he must have been thinking about the church at Antioch when he wrote this, because he saw a church in Corinth falling apart, literally just eating itself alive from the inside out. And in 1 Corinthians 9, he recounts to them all of the efforts that he has made in order to try to maintain church unity. He says, though I be free from all men, this is 1 Corinthians 9:19, though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. And unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. To them that are under the law, as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. To them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without the law. To the weak became I as weak, that I might gain the weak. I am made all things to all men, that I might by all means save some. And this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. Now that's a strong message. If we can get to that point in our own hearts, where not just, hey, I have to do it or I don't have to do it, but no, I want to do it because the gospel's at stake. My witness to others is at stake. My love for others in my church family is at stake. Our unity is at stake. These things are at stake, and a lot of it revolves around our conduct. How we conduct ourselves in the midst of a mixed group of people who don't all see the things the same way. And when we do that, we'll find that we have lived out our faith in a very practical and loving way.